Hello and welcome back, my lovely students. As promised, I'm back with part 2 of American literature. I'm Dr. Vijayalakshmi Nayak, Assistant Professor, Department of English, GFGC and PG Center, Dharwad. Here in part 2, I'll be discussing some important writers from American literature. Ralph Waldo Emerson. He's one of the most quoted authors in the world. In his writings, we find epigrammatic terseness. An American essayist, poet, and popular philosopher, he was a great original thinker and believed in transcendental ideas. He believed in independence of thought and art. He emphasized on supreme self-reliance. He formed a lifelong friendship with Carlyle, the great Victorian writer and thinker. He edited a magazine called The Dial. He affirmed his beliefs in transcendental ideas in his first book, The Nature. His American Scholar is sometimes called America's Intellectual Declaration of Independence. Henry David Thoreau, an American essayist, poet, and practical philosopher. He became closely attached to Emerson and joined his Transcendental Club. He started contributing to The Dial, the magazine The Dial. He lived on Waldane Pond, which resulted in his memorable work, Waldane. He was a great philosopher and lover of nature, a great individualist. He took an anti-slavery stand and he lived a simple life in a hut. He developed the idea of passive resistance and he influenced great people like Gandhiji and Tolstoy. He also advocated for civil liberties in his essay, Civil Disobedience. Walt Whitman. Whitman can be considered as one of the greatest poets of modern times. He was influenced by Emerson, Indian philosophy, and people in general. His influence is general and pervasive. He influenced poets in England, France, Italy, and America. In fact, Whitman's Leaves of Grass is regarded as the Bible of democracy, and Whitman himself is considered as the poet of democracy. When his Leaves of Grass appeared in 1855, it was an immediate success. Whitman is a poet of body and soul, and his writings are autobiographical, spiritual, and mystical in tone. We also find a vitality of democracy in his writings. We can also find love for Indian philosophy in his writings. Edgar Allan Poe, a poet, short story writer, and a critic. He was a very controversial writer, but Poe's influence is one of the seminal influences on modern literature. His aesthetic theory has influenced the devotees of art for art's sake. Verlaine, Mallarmé, and other symbolists were inspired by his confusion of sensory impressions. He achieved fame only after his death. His early poems were not recognized. As a critic, he was often harsh and uncompromising. But if we look at the characteristics of his writing, we see a dedication to creation of beauty. There's a lot of symbolism in his writing, and we also find a lot of insight into abnormalities, element of horror and suspense, fantasy. All these can be seen. He was technically very strong in writing. He believed that the short story is superior to the novel because of its unity and intensity. We also find traces of psychological realism in Poe's writing. Henry James. Henry James is one of the most reputed modern fiction writers. a master stylist and craftsman, he is admired and imitated by many writers. He made character more important than the story. He was truly a cosmopolitan writer. He is an American novelist and critic. He came under the influence of Flaubert and Turgenev. The Golden Bowl, The Portrait of a Lady, The Wings of Dor are some of his important works. We see that he is a master craftsman and a fastidious writer. His novels are very organic and cosmopolitan in view. He was a very voluminous writer. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize for Literature 3 times. He is noted for writing from a character's point of view, which allowed him to explore consciousness and perception. Herman Melville, American novelist, poet, and short story writer. He was never recognized as a great writer in his own time, but his novel Moby Dick is now considered as one of the greatest novels of all time. He had experiences of the sea life, and based on his writing is based on personal experiences of sea life. We also find a lot of allegorical romance and psychological romance, along with a lot of symbolism in his writing. He rebelled against social and literary standards of the day. He was re-evaluated in modern age. What I mean is, his works, Melville's works have been studied after his death, and Moby Dick is now considered the sole American epic. He's now considered as one of the major figures of world literature. But unfortunately, in his day and time, he was not appreciated. Nathaniel Hawthorne. He's an American short story writer and novelist. He wrote his famous novel Scarlet Letter at Salem. The novel evokes the gloomy 17th century Puritan atmosphere of New England. Hawthorne is one of the greatest American fiction writers. He achieved high artistic excellence and won the homage of Poe, Melville, and James. We find a lot of Gothic element in his writings, along with idea of sin and redemption. The Puritanic belief in sin. We also find that his writing is very symbolic and allegorical because he had a poet's imagination, I guess. Ernest Hemingway. In the realm of literature, Hemingway is one of the most famous of modern American writers. He was a living legend. Hemingway's critical fortunes have been ebbed and flowed, but his public has known no wavering. He's an American novelist and short story writer. His lifestyle as an artist, war correspondent, and bullfighter was renowned. He suffered multiple injuries many a time, but his undaunted spirit never gave in. His suicide was equally sensational. His fictional world reflects his own life. His heroes are involved in a world of violence and struggle. Whether it is The Old Man and the Sea, or A Farewell to Arms, or The Sun Also Rises, we all see that his fictional world is full of manliness and dominated by violence. Even his style echoes violence and cynicism. We find a lot of dislocated social relationships in his writings. It is filled with irony, wit, and lyricism. He has a very indirect way of narration. What we see is a lot of impersonal quality in his writing, with a lot of tragic overtone. Hemingway won the Nobel Prize in 1954, and his contribution to modern literature remains great.